It was a late afternoon in the quiet town, the kind of small community where everyone knew everyone else, where doors were rarely locked, and children's laughter echoed down narrow streets. The family at the center of this story lived on the edge of town, in a modest home framed by tall, weather-beaten pines that whispered in the wind. There was an ordinary serenity in their lives, a mother humming as she set the table, a father tinkering in the garage with the faint smell of motor oil in the air, children chasing each other barefoot across the yard, their faces bright with innocence and careless joy. It was a life that seemed unremarkable, yet in its quiet simplicity lay the fragile threads of love and routine that would soon be ruptured. Outside, the sky was changing with a subtle insistence, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Clouds gathered and thickened, darkening the afternoon to an almost twilight gloom. The first drops of rain began to fall, tapping against the roof in uneven rhythms, a soft percussion that carried both comfort and unease. By the hour, the storm had grown, winds whipping through the trees, shaking the branches like giant hands. Windows rattled in their frames, leaves skittered across the ground, and the air grew heavy with the metallic scent of impending rain. Yet inside, the family remained blissfully unaware, absorbed in their routines, the mother calling the children in for dinner, the father carefully locking his tools away. Neighbors would later recall that day as one of those rare moments when nature seemed almost sentient, when the air itself carried a warning. Some had looked up at the swelling clouds and felt a prickle of unease, an instinct that something was about to change. The storm, though violent, was not entirely uncommon for the region, yet there was a strange quality to it, a restlessness that gnawed at the edges of perception. It was as if the world itself sensed that the ordinary piece of this family's life was about to fracture. Within the house, small, intimate details played out like a quiet film. The youngest child, a boy of 8, clutched a small toy car, rolling it across the worn wooden floorboards with obsessive care, the sound of the wheels clicking a rhythm that seemed to echo in the vastness of the empty spaces soon to be left behind. The older daughter sat at the kitchen table, sketching in a notebook, unaware that these drawings would one day be all that remained of her perspective, frozen in time. The father moved between rooms with a deliberate calm, securing windows against the rising wind, while the mother's voice carried soft instructions, reminders, and laughter, a tether to normalcy against the encroaching storm. It is often in these quiet domestic moments that tragedy finds its foothold, not with a scream or flash, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The family's last hours were filled with these ordinary acts, yet each one now takes on a strange, almost sacred weight when looked back upon. The way the youngest child's fingers fumbled with the toy car, the way the mother's eyes lingered on the window, the way the father paused to listen to the wind, these are the fragments that time preserves when the larger picture vanishes. Outside, the storm intensified, lightning flashing across the sky, briefly illuminating the trees and the house in stark, surreal clarity. Thunder followed, a low rumble that seemed to shake the foundations of the earth itself. The wind tore through the streets, rattling mailboxes and scattering debris. Rain hammered the roofs, pooling in the gutters, overflowing onto the muddy paths leading away from the house. From the safety of inside, these natural assaults might have seemed dramatic but containable, a test of human resilience. Yet to the family, and to those who would later try to understand what happened, these details became markers in a timeline of disappearance, points of reference for a narrative that never fully revealed itself. The evening approached with unnatural speed, clouds swallowing the light in heavy folds. Shadows deepened inside the house, elongating across furniture and faces. The children, once laughing and playful, began to sense the tension, the subtle anxiety carried in the rhythm of wind and rain. Parents moved with quiet urgency, still unaware of the full scale of what the storm would bring. Outside, the storm seemed to thrum with an intelligence, a force indifferent to human concerns, shaping the contours of the evening into a prelude for something unthinkable. And then, as if time itself hesitated, the house, the family, vanished from the world of certainty. The storm raged on, indifferent, erasing footprints, washing away traces, leaving the small town to awaken to absence. The ordinary became haunting, the laughter turned into echoes, the home, once a place of warmth, became a silent void. In retrospect, those final hours are remembered in fragments, a door left slightly ajar, a forgotten toy, the lingering smell of dinner in the air, the trembling shadows of a storm that would become a story no one could fully explain. It is in this suspension between presence and absence that the mystery begins, where every ordinary detail becomes a clue, and every heartbeat carries the weight of the unknown. The morning of the storm arrived with an uneasy calm, a deceptive serenity that belied the chaos lurking just beyond the horizon. The air was thick with humidity, and the sky hung low, an oppressive gray that seemed to press down on the small town. Birds moved in erratic patterns, and the scent of wet earth mingled with the distant tang of ozone, warning those sensitive to nature's moods that something was amiss. The family, however, remained absorbed in the routines of a day that would soon unravel into an unsolvable mystery. Breakfast was hurried and practical, the father reading the newspaper while balancing a cup of coffee, the mother making scrambled eggs and toast, the children arguing softly over who would sit where. Ordinary. Familiar. Comfortable. By mid-morning, the storm began to assert itself with a subtle insistence. Gusts of wind rattled the window panes, carrying with them small fragments of debris from the streets and yards beyond. The neighbors, some already familiar with the region's unpredictable weather, looked up at the sky with wary eyes. There was a strange quality to the wind that day, a sense of orchestration in its pattern, like a conductor signaling the beginning of a sinister symphony. Power lines swayed precariously, the hum of electricity warping with the changing pressure, and trees bent at impossible angles. Yet the family carried on, unaware that these atmospheric signals would mark the last day they would be seen alive. Around noon, the storm intensified. Rain fell in thick sheets, bouncing off roofs and soaking the muddy earth below. The father had decided to secure the garage, moving cautiously as the wind threatened to slam the door shut behind him. The mother looked on from the kitchen, voice raised above the roar of the weather, giving instructions as she wiped water from the windowsill. Inside, the children watched through the glass, mesmerized by the chaotic beauty of lightning splitting the sky. There was a strange duality in that moment, wonder and fear intertwined, innocence observing destruction, a fleeting calm before disaster. Neighbors would later recount seeing a small family vehicle, already packed for errands or a weekend outing, struggling against the driving rain, tires skimming over puddles that reflected the gray light in fractured patterns. Some swore they noticed something odd about the way it moved, almost as if the storm itself resisted the vehicle's progress. Others reported lights flickering strangely, shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees. These fragmented observations would later become crucial threads in a tapestry of uncertainty, a collage of moments that refused to coalesce into certainty. Inside the house, mundane details continued to paint a portrait of normalcy. The mother called the children to check on their homework, the father fixed a loose panel in the porch, and the youngest child, oblivious to the heightening tension, continued to play with the small toy car that had become a silent companion over the years. There was a rhythm to these actions, a cadence of life that somehow persisted even as the world outside seemed to threaten to engulf it entirely. The storm's sound grew louder, a constant, pulsating drumbeat, yet within the walls of the house, human life clung to its ordinary routines with a fragile resilience. And then, subtle anomalies began to emerge, almost imperceptible at first. A sudden flicker of light in the sky not quite matching lightning. A fleeting shadow crossing the yard in the corner of a neighbor's eye. The air carried a strange electrical tension, causing small objects to quiver as though responding to an unseen force. The children glanced nervously at the windows, their play interrupted by the odd patterns of the storm. The father paused mid-action, a muscle in his jaw tightening as he sensed that something was out of place. Even the mother's hum faltered, her voice catching for a moment, almost drowned by the roar of wind and rain. These subtle disturbances, in hindsight, were the first signs of the anomaly that would consume their day, marks of a natural world that had shifted its rules without explanation. By late afternoon, visibility had dropped to near zero. The rain fell in sheets so heavy it seemed to erase the landscape itself, washing out the familiar markers of streets, fences, and paths. The wind howled like a living entity, forcing doors to slam shut, carrying loose items into dangerous trajectories, turning ordinary branches into potential weapons. And still, the family moved with cautious determination, trying to maintain order and safety in a world that had begun to twist unpredictably around them. They gathered essentials, double-checked windows and doors, reassured the children with smiles that masked a growing unease. There was a tension in the air, subtle but undeniable, a quiet horror forming as the natural world betrayed expectation. Witnesses from nearby properties would later describe an eerie tableau, flashes of light reflecting in puddles, shapes barely discernible behind the sheets of rain, the occasional glimpse of the family's car seemingly stuck in the storm's grip. Some swore that the car's headlights flickered unnaturally, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and distort. Others saw forms in the periphery that vanished when approached. These descriptions, fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, painted a psychological landscape as haunting as the physical one. The storm was no longer just a weather event, it became a character in its own right, shaping the narrative, bending reality, and pushing human perception to its limits. And then, as the sky darkened to a steel-gray black, the first cries of the children, brief and startled, hinted at the full scale of the danger. The mother's voice rose above the storm in urgent tones, calling, consoling, commanding. The father moved with decisive action, securing a door, checking the children, and bracing himself against the violent gusts. The scene was cinematic in its tension, human resilience against an indifferent and overpowering force of nature. The town would later remember that afternoon not just for the storm, but for the sudden, impossible absence that followed, the way ordinary life had been swallowed by something neither human nor predictable. By evening, the storm reached its peak ferocity, and the family disappeared. Witness accounts became fragmented whispers, a shape moving in the wrong direction, a flash of light, a sound swallowed by wind. Nothing concrete remained, no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing to anchor the day in certainty. The house sat, silent and intact, yet empty in a way that would haunt the community for decades. Objects remained where they were last touched, a chair slightly askew, a cup of coffee still warm enough to suggest abrupt departure, a small toy abandoned in a hallway. The day closed not with resolution but with questions, with the kind of psychological weight that settles into a town and refuses to leave. What had happened in the storm? How could a family vanish so completely in a matter of hours? Each passing moment without answers deepened the mystery, sowing fear and speculation, marking the beginning of a story that would grow cold in official records but remain alive in the collective memory of those who had witnessed, or imagined, the impossible. The storm, indifferent and unstoppable, became the canvas on which absence was painted, leaving behind an emptiness that would echo through time. As the storm subsided into a muted drizzle, the town awoke to an eerie stillness, the kind that presses down on the chest and makes every sound feel amplified. Streets that had been alive with children playing and neighbors exchanging greetings were now desolate, littered with leaves, branches, and the detritus of nature's rage. The family's home stood at the edge of this scene like a silent sentinel, doors closed, lights off, and no sign of life within. A neighbor, peering through a rain-smeared window, was the first to sense the gravity of what had happened. Calls were made, questions asked, voices trembling with disbelief. Slowly, the realization settled. The family had vanished, and no one knew where to begin searching. Within hours, the small police force was mobilized, joined by neighbors who refused to stay behind. Flashlights cut through the mist, and muddy boots sank into the sodden earth as groups fanned out, calling the family's names into the cold morning air. Each call echoed strangely, bouncing off the houses and trees, returning with a hollow emptiness that tightened the chest. The children's laughter, which had seemed so constant the day before, was replaced by a haunting silence that seemed to amplify every footstep. Volunteers combed the yards, checked the garages, and followed every path leading away from the house, but the storm had washed away almost all traces of movement. It was as if the family had simply been lifted from the earth, leaving behind only the ordinary objects of their lives to testify to their existence. Searchers found the first unsettling signs: a broken toy partially buried in mud, a kitchen chair pushed askew as though its occupant had risen abruptly, and a single footprint, shallow and fading, on the edge of the driveway. These small details, mundane in isolation, became magnified in the minds of those who sought them, each one a thread in a growing tapestry of anxiety. Every moment spent searching carried an unspoken question. How could a family disappear in a place so familiar, in a town so small, under circumstances that seemed entirely ordinary? The juxtaposition of normalcy and absence was almost unbearable, a psychological pressure that seemed to tighten with each passing hour. By midday, the search expanded. Police and volunteers moved beyond the immediate yard, scanning surrounding fields, forests, and streams, following any hint of tracks or disturbance. The wind, though gentler than the day before, still carried a cold bite that left faces stinging and clothes soaked. Dogs were brought in, their noses close to the ground, sniffing for the faintest hint of human presence. Yet the dogs too seemed baffled, circling in confusion, unable to locate any definitive trail. The psychological weight of frustration began to settle in among the searchers. It was one thing to track a missing person, another entirely to chase a ghost that left no trace. Rumors began to creep into the periphery of the search. Some claimed to have seen a fleeting silhouette in the distance, just beyond the tree line. Others described a vehicle moving erratically in the muddy streets, though no confirmation followed. Every new account was treated with cautious interest, yet often ended in disappointment or doubt. Even as hope persisted, it was tempered by the awareness that something inexplicable had occurred. The ordinary logic of lost families, of children wandering off or getting delayed, simply did not apply here. Each passing hour of fruitless searching deepened the community's unease, layering fear over confusion. Inside the police station, detectives pored over maps and lists, tracing every possible route, reconstructing the family's last known movements with painstaking care. Their faces, usually marked by professionalism, now bore tension and exhaustion. Phone calls came from relatives, neighbors, and friends, each voice edged with panic, pleading for information, offering potential leads. Yet as the hours stretched into evening, the threads frayed, each lead dissolving into uncertainty. Officers began to speak in hushed tones about possibilities that had once seemed absurd. Abduction? Accident? Something stranger? The storm itself, with its ferocity and suddenness, was considered as a factor, though even that explanation felt incomplete, unsatisfying. Meanwhile, the emotional toll on the community intensified. Families gathered, sharing anxiety and mutual disbelief, haunted by the thought that the missing family could be anywhere, or nowhere at all. Children who had played with the missing siblings wandered aimlessly, their faces pale, struggling to comprehend absence in a way that only innocence allows. Adults spoke in quiet, urgent tones, clinging to routines even as the ordinary logic of life seemed suspended. The air itself carried a kind of collective grief, a shared tension that made even the smallest sounds, the dripping of water, the rustle of leaves, feel amplified and ominous. By nightfall, the search continued under portable lights, the beams cutting through mist and shadows, illuminating the strange and unremarkable objects left behind. A half-finished meal on the kitchen counter, a chair still warm from someone who would never return, a garden tool left leaning against the shed. Each object became a symbol, a haunting reminder of presence abruptly interrupted. Volunteers whispered to each other, voicing theories they did not fully believe, their words filling the spaces where answers should have been. It was as though the town itself was holding its breath, caught between the reality of what had vanished and the possibility that the truth would never be known. Even as exhaustion set in, no one could bring themselves to stop. The storm's aftermath had created not just physical chaos but psychological disarray. The ordinary had been upended, and the community was compelled to act, to search, to hope, even as logic faltered. In the quiet moments, when flashlights scanned empty fields or rain-slicked streets, a sense of unreality descended. Time seemed elastic, minutes stretched into hours, and every familiar landmark became alien under the shadow of absence. The family, once ordinary, was now mythic in its disappearance, their last known day stretching endlessly in the minds of all who sought them. By the early hours of the next morning, the search had covered every immediate area. Drenched and exhausted, volunteers and officers convened to compare notes, sharing every fragment, every fleeting sighting, every whisper of possibility. And yet, despite their efforts, the family remained vanished, leaving behind only questions and a community suspended in disbelief. The ordinary rhythms of life had been fractured, replaced by a haunting void that would linger in the town's collective memory for decades to come. Objects, tracks, fleeting shadows, all failed to coalesce into a coherent explanation. It was as if the storm had not merely passed through, but had opened a rift in reality, swallowing the family whole and leaving the world slightly askew, as if it had lost something it could never reclaim. As the days turned into weeks, the initial urgency of the search faded, replaced by a strange, persistent tension that settled over the town like a low fog. The streets, once filled with neighbors aiding the search, now carried only whispers. Conversations began to twist around uncertainty, blending fact with imagination, and speculation with fear. Windows were opened cautiously, doors closed with lingering hesitation. Every glance toward the forest or the muddy fields beyond the town sparked a fleeting shiver, an unspoken question hovering in the air. Where had the family gone? Those who had watched them play in the yard, who had shared cups of coffee or casual smiles, now felt an almost unbearable weight of absence. Rumors grew like ivy, creeping along the edges of conversations. One neighbor claimed to have seen faint lights flickering in the tree line during the night, though no one could confirm it. Another insisted they heard voices calling for help, carried briefly on the wind, then swallowed by silence. Each whisper, fragmentary and often contradictory, became a thread in the town's collective imagination. People began to replay moments from the storm in their minds, noticing small, overlooked details. The unusual way the wind had shifted, the odd flicker of headlights, the fleeting shadows that had moved independently of anything recognizable. The ordinary storm had become mythologized, its details expanding to fit the human need for explanation. Local folklore, once relegated to children's stories or casual warnings, now resurfaced with chilling relevance. Tales of lost travelers swallowed by forests, of spectral figures appearing in storms, and of the land itself harboring secrets passed between generations, circulated in hushed tones. Parents warned children not to wander near the woods, citing both reason and legend. Elderly neighbors recalled previous disappearances, dismissed at the time as accidents or misadventures, and now felt a terrifying resonance. The ordinary landscape of the town, its streets, fields, and forests, was no longer just familiar terrain. It had become a theater of uncertainty, a place where the line between natural and supernatural blurred. At the same time, skepticism and rational attempts to explain the disappearance clashed with these growing tales. Police officers, journalists, and visiting investigators sifted through the evidence, searching for a plausible explanation. They reviewed weather reports, interviewed witnesses, and reconstructed timelines, yet every rational model seemed incomplete. The storm had been powerful but not unprecedented, the terrain familiar, and the family ordinary. Yet ordinary logic failed to account for their complete disappearance. This tension between human reason and imagination deepened the town's collective unease, highlighting the fragility of perception when confronted with the inexplicable. Even in homes distant from the vanished family, the emotional ripple was undeniable. Families who had not known them personally felt the weight of the unknown pressing into daily life. Children stopped wandering near the forest edges, adults hesitated when driving past the now infamous house, and neighbors exchanged knowing glances instead of words. The disappearance had transformed into a psychological presence, an invisible force threading through the town. Dreams became restless, some reported seeing the family in fleeting visions, their laughter echoing eerily in half-remembered moments. Reality and imagination began to entwine, each reinforcing the other in a subtle, haunting rhythm. Those who were closest to the family experienced a more acute form of this tension. Parents, friends, and siblings wrestled with guilt, grief, and the gnawing fear that the ordinary actions of the storm day, choices about leaving the house, securing windows, deciding when to drive, might have contributed to something unthinkable. Sleep became fragmented, daily routines hollowed out by the absence of answers. The ordinary textures of life, cooking, cleaning, walking past familiar streets, were now laced with reminders of a void that could not be filled. The town itself became a mirror of their grief, streets empty, shadows long, every sound amplified in a way that reminded them constantly of what was missing. As the months passed, the story transformed into legend within the community, a tale retold with subtle variations that deepened the emotional resonance. Some insisted they felt the family's presence in the house, a warmth or energy lingering even in their absence. Others spoke of strange lights over the forest or peculiar sounds carried by the wind, phenomena they would never have noticed before the disappearance. Each account, no matter how rational or supernatural, reinforced the sense that this was not simply a missing family, but a story that had embedded itself into the psychological and emotional fabric of the town. And yet, beneath the whispers and folklore, there remained a persistent, aching desire for truth. Even as imagination filled the gaps, a part of every neighbor, friend, and relative longed for tangible evidence. Every rumor, every spectral tale, became a placeholder for the reality that had eluded them. The story of that vanished family was no longer just a record of absence, it had become a mirror for human curiosity, fear, and the need to reconcile with the incomprehensible. Time passed, but the tension never fully lifted. The town learned to live in the shadow of the unknown, carrying both the weight of what had been lost and the haunting allure of mystery. In this delicate balance between rumor and reason, imagination and reality, the stage was set for the next chapter of revelation. The storm had ended, the immediate search concluded, yet the mystery had only begun to take shape in the minds of those left behind. It was in this slow, almost imperceptible transformation, from urgency to obsession, from absence to legend, that the story gained its haunting, cinematic depth, a tension that would hold for decades until new eyes and technology would attempt to pierce the veil. As months turned into years, the frantic search for the missing family gradually faded into a quiet resignation. The initial flurry of activity, neighbors scouring the woods, police combing fields, volunteers carrying flashlights into the dark, had dwindled to occasional reports and sporadic calls from concerned outsiders. The town, once electrified by urgency, settled into a strange, lingering stillness. Streets that had carried the echo of footsteps and voices now seemed unnaturally empty, and the house at the edge of town, the epicenter of absence, became a silent monument to the unresolved. Those who had loved the family most felt the weight of each passing day like a slow, grinding ache, while the rest of the community carried a subtler but no less pervasive tension, a quiet anxiety that life had shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably. Detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case eventually moved on to other assignments, leaving behind boxes of notes, maps, and photographs that gathered dust in filing cabinets. The official reports labeled the family as missing, presumed lost to circumstance, the kind of bureaucratic language that provides closure only on paper. The town's memory, however, refused to align with such neat conclusions. People recalled the family's laughter, the children playing in the yard, the father's steady presence in the garage, the mother's warmth in the kitchen, images that contrasted sharply with the sterile finality of case reports. This tension between human memory and official narrative became the town's quiet, collective torment. Emotionally, the void left by the family's disappearance began to transform into an almost tangible presence. Friends and relatives felt their absence in small, poignant ways: an empty swing moving in the wind, a familiar scent lingering in an abandoned room, a toy lying in the grass, untouched for years. These fragments of life, preserved in place or memory, became symbols of what had been lost. Each day without closure deepened the town's psychological scar, embedding the family's absence into the rhythm of life itself. Ordinary activities were now layered with a sense of unease: walking past the family's house, passing through familiar streets, or even hearing children play in a nearby yard could evoke the eerie sensation of missing presence. Local authorities continued to receive occasional tips, letters, or reports from people convinced they had glimpsed something unusual, yet none led to resolution. Each failed lead reinforced the sense of helplessness, a quiet horror that ordinary investigative methods were inadequate against what had transpired. Even technology and record-keeping of the era were limited, leaving crucial moments unrecorded and memories unreliable. The storm, the environment, and perhaps something unexplainable had conspired to erase the family from both physical and cognitive space. Over time, frustration mingled with fascination, and the case began to acquire a mythic dimension, discussed not just as an unsolved disappearance, but as a story that defied ordinary logic. The emotional weight extended beyond the immediate circle of family and neighbors. The town itself seemed to hold its collective breath, haunted by a shared memory of uncertainty. Children who had grown up with the missing siblings carried forward an incomplete story, filled with questions that never fully resolved. Parents and friends grappled with an amalgam of hope, grief, and guilt, haunted by the lingering sense that something could have been done differently. This psychological pressure created an invisible tension, a quiet hum under the surface of daily life. Ordinary conversations became punctuated with avoidance or speculation, and silence often spoke more loudly than words. Over the years, journalists occasionally revisited the case, producing human interest pieces or retrospective articles. They interviewed neighbors, relatives, and even former search volunteers, each recounting details that blurred the line between fact and memory. Some described subtle, almost spectral sensations: glimpses of movement behind curtains, lights flickering in the trees at night, a sense of presence in the very rooms left empty. Whether these were products of grief or fragments of reality, they reinforced the haunting aura that had settled over the town. In these stories, the ordinary became extraordinary, and absence itself acquired a kind of narrative force, shaping both memory and imagination. The house where the family had lived stood largely untouched, a frozen monument to what had been. Windows remained streaked with rain from that fateful storm, gardens grew wild with neglect, and the doors, once welcoming, now seemed like thresholds to avoid. Every object left behind, the toys, furniture, photographs, became charged with significance, silent witnesses to a life abruptly interrupted. Residents passing by could not help but notice the quiet emptiness, the way the house seemed to breathe absence, and a subtle unease settled in the chest of all who looked upon it. The town had become a living archive of loss, each street and building quietly preserving traces of what was once ordinary and is now irretrievably absent. Emotionally, the community oscillated between hope and resignation. Some held on to the faint possibility of discovery, searching through old maps, revisiting the forest edges, or recalling overlooked details. Others succumbed to the finality of presumption, imagining the family gone forever, swallowed by the storm, or taken by unknown forces. Even as time passed, the psychological imprint of the disappearance remained. Conversations carried a cautious reverence, memories were tinged with sorrow, and the air itself seemed heavier with the weight of the unanswered. The ordinary measures of closure, explanations, evidence, resolution, were denied, replaced by a lingering shadow that refused to dissipate. By the 5th year, the disappearance had cemented itself in the town's collective consciousness. It was no longer just a family lost to circumstance, it had become a story that shaped identity, a shared psychological landmark. Every whisper of wind through the trees, every shadow cast at dusk, carried the faint echo of that storm and the family's vanishing. The case files, still untouched in the police archive, seemed irrelevant to the living memory that now defined the town. The narrative of absence had grown independent, almost alive, feeding on curiosity, grief, and speculation. It was a haunting reminder that some mysteries do not fade with time, they deepen, inscribe themselves into place in psyche, and wait silently for new eyes to uncover them. Even as the years stretched into decades, the story of the vanished family refused to be buried. While the official investigation had long since cooled, a small but determined group of individuals, relatives, journalists, and amateur investigators, refused to surrender to the silence. Their obsession was not merely intellectual, it was emotional, psychological, almost visceral. Each detail, no matter how minor, became a thread to pull at, a potential lifeline to connect the fragmented past to the present. Old photographs were scrutinized for anomalies, letters reread with a detective's precision, and maps traced repeatedly, searching for the imperceptible patterns that might reveal what ordinary eyes had missed. The storm, though long past, remained a central figure in these inquiries, a mysterious force that had reshaped reality and memory alike. Family members carried the weight of absence with an intimacy that outsiders could not comprehend. Every holiday, every anniversary, every passing birthday brought a wave of remembrance, punctuated by silent tears and whispered memories. They returned to the empty house, walking its perimeter, touching its weathered walls, and imagining the daily lives that had been erased. Some spent hours retracing the children's footsteps, walking the paths they had known, replaying the storm in their minds as though by reconstructing it they might retrieve what had been lost. In these efforts, hope and grief existed in a delicate balance, a hope so persistent it seemed almost irrational, and grief so pervasive it had become part of their very being. Journalists and amateur sleuths approached the story with a different, yet equally consuming, intensity. Long drives to the abandoned town, late-night research in public records, phone calls to distant witnesses, they undertook all these tasks with a quiet, obsessive energy. The internet, when it became accessible, allowed fragments of the story to spread beyond the town, attracting curious minds and sympathetic observers, each contributing theories, speculations, or overlooked clues. Yet the deeper they delved, the more the mystery seemed to resist explanation. Time had erased certain details, altered memories, and removed physical traces, leaving the story both tangible and elusive, a phantom that could be glimpsed but never grasped fully. Psychologically, this prolonged engagement with absence created a haunting rhythm in the lives of those involved. Dreams were filled with vivid imagery of the storm, the children, the house, and fleeting, ungraspable shapes that seemed to drift just beyond comprehension. Ordinary tasks, washing dishes, driving through town, walking past familiar fields, were layered with subtle anxiety. Each shadow, each unusual sound, even the smallest change in weather, was filtered through the lens of a decades-old trauma that refused to release its hold. For the family's relatives, this was compounded by guilt and self-recrimination, a persistent wondering whether some overlooked choice or action could have prevented the disappearance. In pursuing the story, investigators began to rely on tools that earlier generations could not access. Old maps were cross-referenced with newly available satellite imagery, weather data analyzed with modern software, and eyewitness accounts catalogued into timelines of painstaking detail. Each methodical step carried the weight of decades-long anticipation, the emotional tension of confronting a mystery that had defied closure for so long. While the search was methodical, the emotional resonance never faded. A shadow of fear, grief, and curiosity hovered over every action, and the line between investigation and personal catharsis blurred. These efforts were not limited to logic or technology. Many sought answers through intuition, speculation, or spiritual reflection. Dreams, fleeting impressions, and subtle clues noticed in passing became part of a larger tapestry, a mosaic of human longing to reconcile with the incomprehensible. Townspeople watched these obsessive inquiries with a mix of sympathy, disbelief, and unease. They understood, perhaps better than outsiders, that the storm and the disappearance had left an indelible mark on the collective psyche, a wound that refused to close. The absence had become a presence in itself, a constant companion for those who would not let the story fade into obscurity. Emotionally, the obsession carried both burden and solace. For some, it was unbearable, a slow erosion of normalcy as the past encroached upon the present. For others, it was a lifeline, a way to maintain a connection to those who had been lost, a thread that tethered memory to reality. These pursuits illuminated the paradox of human grief, that in attempting to uncover truth, one often confronts deeper questions about existence, mortality, and the impermanence of ordinary life. The search was as much about understanding the storm, the disappearance, and the family, as it was about confronting the fragility of memory and the relentless passage of time. Even with all the modern tools and decades of persistent research, the mystery retained its allure precisely because it resisted resolution. Every potential clue seemed to open a new layer of questions rather than closing any doors. Shadows in the forest, flickers on old photographs, inconsistencies in memory, all became focal points of speculation, hints of something larger and more inexplicable lurking just beyond human perception. The story's hold on those who pursued it was absolute. It demanded attention, curiosity, and emotional investment. Time did not diminish the tension, it intensified it, creating a slow-burning psychological pressure that mirrored the unresolved trauma of the storm itself. And yet, even in the midst of obsession, glimmers of awe and wonder emerged. The meticulous reconstruction of events, the tracing of anomalies, the dedication to remembering and understanding, offered a strange beauty, a testament to human resilience, curiosity, and the enduring power of emotional connection. The vanished family, though absent in body, had become central to a narrative that transcended ordinary disappearance. They existed as both a memory and a mystery, hauntingly alive in the minds of those who refused to let silence define them. Decades had passed since the storm, yet the story of the vanished family remained etched into the fabric of the town and the minds of those who refused to let it fade. 4 years, attempts to unravel the mystery had yielded nothing but fragments, blurred memories, fleeting glimpses of shapes in the forest, and the stubborn absence of physical evidence. And then, almost by accident, the breakthrough came from a source that had been overlooked in 1978, satellite imagery. These photographs, captured during a period when such technology was still in its infancy, had been archived and forgotten, their potential significance buried beneath decades of bureaucracy and technological limitations. The discovery began with a researcher, a journalist with a meticulous obsession, one who had spent years tracing every possible lead. While sifting through declassified materials, he noticed a set of high-altitude images that corresponded precisely to the days surrounding the family's disappearance. At first glance, they seemed like any other archival photos, grainy, monochrome, and largely devoid of detail. Yet something about the alignment, the perspective, or perhaps the passage of time made them tantalizing. There was a sense of latent possibility in these images, a whisper from the past hinting that the story might not yet be complete. The first viewing of the images was uneventful, almost anticlimactic. Trees, roads, fields, and rooftops stretched across the frames like a quiet, indifferent landscape. But then, as the researcher adjusted contrast, brightness, and perspective, small anomalies began to emerge. Shapes that had been invisible at first glance revealed themselves, a faint trace of a path that had not existed in other images, a light-colored object partially obscured by vegetation, an irregular clearing in what should have been solid forest. Each discovery was tentative, the kind of detail that could be easily dismissed, yet the emotional pull was undeniable. Here was evidence, however small and cryptic, of something previously invisible, a footprint in time waiting to be followed. As the images were analyzed more thoroughly, the sense of discovery deepened. Specialists in cartography, geospatial analysis, and environmental reconstruction were brought in, drawn by the possibility of solving a decades-old mystery. They enhanced the images using modern techniques, piecing together sequences that revealed subtle movements and changes in the terrain. Every adjustment, every enhancement, was a slow, deliberate unveiling of the hidden landscape. The ordinary, which had once concealed the family, now began to hint at the extraordinary. Shadows, previously indistinguishable from natural foliage, now suggested structures or disturbances that should not have been there. The forest, so familiar and yet so impenetrable, was suddenly readable in a way it had never been before. Emotionally, the revelation was staggering. For relatives, journalists, and obsessive investigators, these images were not just data, they were portals back to a lost day, tangible evidence that the family had existed in a physical space that could now be interrogated. Each anomaly, no matter how small, carried the weight of decades of hope, grief, and unanswered questions. The images bridged the gap between absence and presence, giving form to a story that had previously existed only in memory, rumor, and imagination. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, a reminder of how fragile human perception can be, and how much the ordinary can conceal. The psychological effect of this discovery was profound. Observers felt a mixture of awe and dread, the thrill of approaching an answer tempered by the chilling realization of what the storm had obscured. As more layers of imagery were revealed, the outlines of objects began to suggest human presence, yet the specifics remained maddeningly elusive. The mind naturally filled in gaps, constructing narratives from shadow and light, questioning what was real and what was imagined. The images acted as both confirmation and provocation, a visual echo of absence that demanded interpretation and invited obsession. Researchers worked in teams, cross-referencing satellite data with historical maps, topographical surveys, and eyewitness accounts. Each frame, each pixel, became a piece of a puzzle that had defied solution for decades. Slowly, patterns emerged. Paths that aligned with reported routes of the family's vehicle, unusual clearings in dense forest that matched locations noted by neighbors, and faint shapes that suggested objects or debris displaced in ways inconsistent with natural processes. Every subtle anomaly deepened the mystery while simultaneously offering hope. The storm, once an unpredictable antagonist, now seemed to leave a traceable imprint, a clue embedded in the landscape itself. There was a poetic quality to this reconstruction, almost cinematic in its unfolding. Time itself seemed to bend. The storm of 1978 and the satellite images of that era converged in a moment of discovery, decades apart yet intimately connected. For relatives and researchers alike, there was a sense of standing on the threshold between what was known and what had been forever lost. Each image revealed the intersection of human life and natural force, the delicate thread upon which ordinary existence had been balanced and then violently disrupted. The technical process, enhancing images, overlaying maps, analyzing shadows, was matched by a deeply human experience of wonder, fear, and longing. Yet, for all their clarity, the images did not offer simple answers. They teased the observer with possibility, revealing enough to provoke emotional resonance without fully disclosing the truth. There was a haunting ambiguity. The family's presence suggested but did not confirm, the landscape offered hints but not resolutions. This interplay of revelation and mystery mirrored the town itself, where memory, rumor, and loss had already created a psychological landscape as intricate and elusive as any satellite photo. Each discovery carried an almost unbearable tension, a quiet suspense that mirrored the storm that had taken the family in the first place. It was in these moments that the power of technology met the depths of human emotion. The images, cold and analytical in origin, became conduits for grief, obsession, and hope. They were more than photographs. They were windows into a lost reality, glimpses of a world in which the family had existed moments before vanishing. Observers felt the weight of decades pressing against each revelation, a reminder that time does not diminish the significance of absence. On the contrary, it magnifies it, rendering every detail, however minor, charged with meaning. And so the discovery of the satellite images became a turning point, a pivot in the long, slow arc of the story. What had once been a mystery confined to memories and whispers was now being traced in light and shadow, in pixels and coordinates, a narrative that demanded careful attention and deliberate interpretation. Emotionally, the revelation was intoxicating. The thrill of proximity to truth, the quiet terror of what it might reveal, and the deep, lingering sorrow of knowing that some part of the story would always remain elusive. The ordinary had been stripped away, exposing the extraordinary traces of absence left behind, and the story was poised to enter its next, even more haunting chapter. The satellite photographs, once enhanced and examined, became more than images. They became a map of the unspeakable. For years, investigators, relatives, and curious strangers had stared into the void of uncertainty, and now, for the first time, there appeared to be a faint trail, a sequence of shapes, shadows, and interruptions in the landscape that together told a story just beyond the reach of clarity. What began as a scattering of anomalies soon formed the outline of movement, a possible route carved by the family's final journey. It was as though the storm itself had left behind a secret language, one that could only be read decades later through the patient lens of persistence. At first, the trail was subtle, a shift in tree canopy that suggested something large had pushed through, a thin pale line that looked less like a natural clearing and more like the faint scar of tires on saturated ground. Piece by piece, these images stitched together a fragile narrative. Investigators laid the satellite maps over local surveys, tracing the faintest impressions against the known geography of 1978. Slowly, they began to see where the family might have traveled when the storm descended, roads that had flooded, paths that dissolved into chaos, and areas where no human should have been at all. The very landscape began to feel complicit, a silent witness that had waited decades to whisper fragments of the truth. Emotionally, this process was excruciating. Every pixel, every faint mark on the images carried unbearable weight, as though one wrong interpretation could collapse the fragile progress. Relatives who saw the overlays were torn between hope and dread. Some clutched at the possibility that these faint trails might lead to long-denied answers, while others recoiled, terrified of what such answers might confirm. The trail was not merely geographical, it was psychological, forcing everyone who followed it to confront the storm again, to relive the night when time split and presence became absence. The further the trail extended, the stranger it became. The images suggested that the family's path diverged from the main road, moving deeper into forest and marshland that had been considered impassable. Theories sprang up like sparks in the dark. Some believed the family had been forced off-road by floodwaters, others that the storm had obscured their sense of direction. A few, more speculative voices suggested something deliberate, that they had been lured or guided into an impossible terrain. The ambiguity itself was unsettling. The trail revealed enough to demand questions but not enough to settle them. It was a puzzle that invited obsession. Investigators who had long since accepted the case as unsolvable found themselves pulled back in. They returned to the archives, comparing photographs of the area from before and after the storm, noting where trees had fallen, rivers had swelled, or clearings had emerged. The storm had rearranged the land in ways that blurred natural and unnatural. Distinguishing accident from intent became a haunting exercise. The line between the family's choices and the storm's violence was indistinguishable, like two shadows overlapping until one could not be separated from the other. The emotional intensity of these discoveries rippled outward. In the town, people spoke of the trail with hushed reverence, as though it were a sacred relic. Those who had grown up hearing the story of the disappearance felt as if the ghosts of their childhood were stirring.